Hi gang. So we're at C sharp, and this is COP2360, and we're going to use Visual Studio for our first GUI application. So up to this point, we've been using a console application. Now we're going to use a Windows Forms application. Now, when we used the console application, we utilized, or we said using some namespace, and within that namespace were specific classes of code that have been created that we can reuse or make copies of, or instantiate is what the term we use in object-oriented programming. So with that said, we're going to create an instance of a Windows Form application, and it'll use different tools and resources that are built into Windows. Now, these do not all work the same on Apple or Mac. If you have Visual Studio for Apple or Mac, there's a lot that has to be installed for your system to run Visual Studio on Apple or Mac. And the .NET framework that is being used does not exist on a Mac computer. So we would have to install that functionality, if you will, onto a Mac. So for these exercises, you are better off running these on a PC because they're PC-driven applications. Okay? All right. So with that said, when you go to do your installation, there's some things you're going to need. And first and foremost, it's listed right here, Windows Form app, something I've utilized in the last application I created. And I used console app recently as well. So here's recent templates that I've used. I created an instance of that default template and built upon it. So it's not that we're being lazy as developers. We're just being efficient and reusing something that we already know works. That's what these namespaces are. They're groups of code that we can use that have been proven to be functional, reliable, and as long as we know where they are, what they need from me, what they're going to do for me, we can utilize them. All right, so let's dig into this a little bit. When you go to do your installation, make sure that we include Windows Form app in there. Don't include everything that's available to you because Visual Studio is very large. Now I've got Windows Visual Studio 2017 that I'm using right now. It's not the latest version available. It happens to be the version that the institution has licensed right now. It's what they've got installed. So at this point, I've got it installed. I want to create a new instance of a Windows Form application. I've got my Solution Explorer interface on the right side. I've got tools available to me on the left, and here's a little start page that'll help me figure out what do I want to do. Do I want to open a project? No, I don't want to open one. I want to create a new one. I could just click here and create a new instance of Forms app. Or I could come up to the top, new project, and that's what I want to do is create a new project. If I created a new Windows Forms app down on the page here, it would do the same thing. It'd create a new project for me. So let's go ahead and we'll create a new project. I last used Visual C# as my programming language. I could use others that are available to me in this installation of Visual Studio. Visual Studio allows us to use a number of different languages to program with. Now, we are creating solutions for, usually it's a business. They've come up with something they need, some issue that needs resolved, some opportunity they need to address, whatever it may be. We are solution providers. Now, it's not just a software solution. We have software developers involved in this solution development. But for what we're doing, let's look at what we're doing from the more broad perspective. We are developing solutions, not just software programmers or software developers. We're solution developers. Now, from that, we could have, the software portion of the solution, as well as the hardware portion, the business portion. Very complex solutions that we're coming up with. We're using Visual C#. It's a visual language, meaning it's an object-oriented language. All right, not a sequential programming language. We're going to have a default name provided to us. Once you name these files, do not rename them later. We're going to determine where we're going to save this project. Now, I've got a specific place I want to put it. I'll put it in my Visual Studios and my projects. All right. And so I've set my path on where it's going to be. So I know where this solution folder that I'm creating is going to end up when it's all said and done. I'm going to create a directory that houses my entire solution. I'm naming it Windows Format 9. Well, let me come up here. I'm going to call it WinForm Project. By default, the solution name changed to align with what I want to call it. I make sure that it is the Windows Form app. I could have created a console application, but I wanted to create a Forms application. It's utilizing the .NET framework. That is that framework that's part of Windows operating system. So I'll go ahead and say OK. And now here it's created this default or templated Windows Form application for me. WinForm Project. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to look in my folders, look to see where it's at. I called it WinForm Project, and here it is. Now, if I look in this folder, I can see within this solution folder, that parent WinForm project that I created, I have my resources and a solution folder, or a solution file, excuse me. And I want to be clear about that. This is a file, not a folder. This is a folder that has in it resources used to build my solution. So if I come back up a level, this parent folder, WinForm project, not this subfolder, the parent folder that I see the path up here that's in my projects folder, that folder is what I need to provide should I want to share this solution with somebody. Okay. The reason being, this SLN file, this solution, think of it as a roadmap that ties everything in here together. All the resources that are being utilized to build this solution exist in here, and I need to have that roadmap, if you will, of how to get this thing all tied together. So if I only gave somebody the roadmap, they don't have the resources to reassemble everything. So everything that's in that parent folder, so if I come back up, everything that's in this WinForm project would be what I need to provide us that solution to somebody. So if I right click on there and I say send to compressed folder, that would create a compressed solution file that I can send somebody, and then when they decompress it, everything they need is in there to see what I did for my project. Okay. So let's talk about this project. What is it that we need to do? We need to ask the user for a name. And I'm not going to be specific to the directions of the assignment, but what I am going to do is explain the tasks associated with completing an initial WinForm project. I change these projects over time, so this may directly align to the project. It may be slightly off. You need to adhere to whatever's in the directions of the assignment. Okay. So on the right is my Explorer, to where I can see the different files associated with my solution. So I had the solution. There's a folder in it that had stuff in it. And then I had that roadmap that I was talking about, the .sln file. We don't even see it here. All right. So with that said, the .sln is what allows us to see all this. Down below, we have a list of objects that have been created that are associated with our project. So our project includes a WinForm. It's named, I should say, Form 1. Now, I prefer to name any of the objects that I create in a way that helps me understand what they are and what they're doing for me and for my solution. So this is a WinForm. I only have one Windows form associated with this project. I may have a number of them. If I have a number of them, I will name each one accordingly at the time I create it, not later. There's a rationale behind why I do things from the start and not coming back and changing things later on. When I add objects to this form, right now the form is an object that I've created. It's an instance of a Windows form based on the form class that I'm able to utilize. So there's a namespace, and then there's a form class within that namespace. Now let's go look at the code behind. Right now we're looking at the design view of form1.cs. I can look at design view. I want to look at code view. So I can click view and then code, and that'll give me the code behind that form. When we look at the code behind it, we see those using statements, and in this IDE, we're able to collapse this up and away if we want. So always make sure when you're not using something, collapse it up so that you're staying cleaner with your code. But let's talk about what we're doing. We're using that system namespace. In that system namespace are a number of different classes. Those classes have associated with them attributes and functionalities. Attributes are, let's compare them to constants and variables. Functionalities would be our methods. So these classes can be described by different attributes associated with them and what they can do. Much like I have this C# class. Now this is a class, it's a course, but I can create different instances of my C# course. I can have a hybrid instance of it. I can have a face-to-face version. I can have a face-to-face night version, day version. All these instances that may share the basic attributes and functionalities. Functionalities, you learn how to do specific tasks or complete specific tasks, understand certain ideas, concepts. Each one would have a specific date, time of meeting, whatever it may be. Those are attributes. I can replicate them over and over and over again over time. I can have more than one at any given time. Each one has its own specific name to identify it, set it apart from any of the others that I've created. But they're all based on that parent class or the foundational class. So we have foundational classes of code that we are being able to replicate and use over and over again. So there's a form class. We're going to use the form class to create an instance of a form called form1. Okay? It is a class and it is within the namespace we've created. Our WinForm project namespace. Namespace. Wait a minute, that's our solution. That's our folder. So let's think about system as a folder, and in that folder are classes of code. In our project, the WinForm project, are potentially classes of code. Right now, I only have one, and that is an instance of the form class, and I named it form1. Okay. Now, when I run my code, I need to initialize that form. Let me get it up and running. Let me build it to where it's actually being displayed. So just because I have something in my code doesn't mean it's actually going to do something until I tell it or programmatically cause this to happen. Okay, so in this form method, I'm accessing that form that I've created, and I'm going to initialize the component associated with it. So when I run this code, it's building my code for me, and here's that form. Now my class of code, my object that I've created, is actually running right now, and I can see over here what's happening. How much memory is it taking? How hard is it beating up my CPU? Different events that have happened. Everything I need to understand how this thing is working. Okay, how efficiently is it running? We'll go ahead and stop it. That's our form as it exists now. Now that form that we've created, form1, I'm going to go ahead and leave it named form1. Let's look at it in design view. And that's the only object that we currently have. We see that the text form1, that's what we see here. Well, let's call that our display project 3. And when I click over here, I see it's now saying project 3. There are different attributes associated with this form that I can change. The coloring of it, the size of it, the behavior of it. These, what we see here, are the properties or attributes associated with this object. I can modify them, change the settings, if you will. Okay? Beyond that, remember I said, these classes have attributes as well as functionality. So let's look at the events or functionalities I have available to my form. Drag and drop as somebody drags over, key down, mouse down, mouse up, leave, somebody change the background. So many things that are associated with this form. So we call these events. These events would trigger some method. The objects that we utilize, and then we'll click on this toolbox here shortly to pick different classes of code that exist so we can create objects that we need on our form to achieve our end goal. So for this project, I'm going to prompt the user to input a string of characters. I'm going to take that string of characters and I'm going to display it on the form. Well, these are similar to things that we've done in a console application, but now we're not doing them in a console. We're doing them in a form. And we're going to have to come up with different resources to achieve each one of these goals. So I'm going to open my toolbox. I'm going to pin it so it stays open so I can see it. Here's my default common controls. I'm going to add some controls to my form. I want a text box. I just click and drag and drop it over. Now this text box is going to be where I receive input from the user. I want to drag a label over, and you can see this blue line that comes up shows that I'm aligned to the top of that text box, and I'll drop that label. By default, it's called label 1. Label 1 is now associated with form 1. There's a linkage between the two. If I go change the name of form 1 now, that's going to mess things up for me in my mapping. Okay. Remember I said, when we first create things, we need to set the names right. Okay. So this first label I created is label 1. Now let's look at the attributes associated with it. Text, I want to say, enter your name here. Okay, and that's the text that will be displayed, and I want to change the name of it to LBL input. Okay. So I have LBL input. There it is there. That's in camel case. Lower L, lower B, lower L, upper I input. My text box is called text box 1. Now I want to call it input text box. I don't have any text in it by default. I want it empty to start with. I want it big enough to receive the names, whatever somebody types in. So I prompt the user, much like we've done in a console application. I allow them to enter something. Then I want to display some output. So that'll be another label. Click, drag, and drop. I'll call this one LBL output. And for the time being, I'm going to put the text associated with that as output. Okay. Now, I've got focus on the form, so that's what we see over here in the properties. If I put focus on this label, that's what we see in the properties. Whatever we have focus on is what we see the properties associated with. So I need to get what the user types in here and send it to this label. Now you remember when we looked over here, what I talked about was I said that the instance of the class I created does not make itself happen. I have to have some code that causes it to get loaded up and display. Go back, look at the design view. So when this is running, just because a user enters text does not mean that I have taken it, stored it in a variable, and then put it somewhere. So our code, what I want to do is, I want to look at, there's going to be an attribute associated with this text box. The attribute is, and I just clicked on it to put focus on that object. That object has associated with it a text attribute. So input text box dot text is an attribute associated with that object. That object has functionality associated with it, but we're just going to talk about the attribute. So that attribute, it's kind of like a variable in a way, but I haven't declared it. It's built into the class. How am I going to get the value associated with that attribute into the value associated with this attribute? I need to have some event happen to cause it to go from one to the other. It's not just going to go on its own. I need an event. And what I want to do is I want to take a button. So I'm going to grab a button and I'm going to drop it over here. And I'm going to make the text submit. So I want this to be a submit button. Okay. And that button, by default, it's button 1. So I'm going to change the name of it to btn output, because that button is going to send that text to my output eventually. Now that button has associated with it attributes. It has text, it has width, it has height, it's got a color, a background. Does it have functionalities associated with it? By default, mouse click or click. They differ in that click could be you hitting the enter key or whatever modality you're causing the click. If focus is on it, somebody hits the enter key, that triggers that click event. Mouse click is only triggered by a left keystroke on the mouse, or left mouse click. So I want to do something associated with this click event. Now I can double click that click event or method in the properties. Let me go back there. Click event, button, output click. Now, so there's a click event associated with that object. When I go back and look at the code behind, here is an event method that's been created for my code. I didn't even have to create it. It by default created it for me. So there's a lot of built-in functionality that exists. It knows that it's private, it's not returning any value, it's just performing a task for me. It's taking something from the object, from the sender, and any event arguments that are going along with it. So there's two things that are being passed to it potentially, and it may do something, it may not. At this point, if you click it, nothing's going to happen. I'll go ahead and run this thing and see what it looks like. Here's our form. It's running and we see what it's doing. If I click submit, nothing happens. Let me go type in Fred. Nothing happens. I am calling or invoking that method, but there is nothing associated with that method, so nothing happens. I'll go ahead and close this, which by default will shut it down. That's the only thing I have running. And let's think about what we want to have happen. So in this method, I want to take what is in that text box and I want to move it to that label, my output label. Let me see, LBL output dot text. So there's a value associated with LBL. And I want to take this attribute and I want to put in it or assign the value to that text box what is currently in. What was the name of our other object? Now, this is where those names become important. Okay, I called it input. It wasn't a little I, it was a big I. Let's come down. See, IN. P. There it is, input text box. So that input text box object that I created has associated with it text, the text attribute. So I created a statement and I said LBL output.text is now equivalent to input text box.text. Now I'm going to come down here and say input text box dot text is now null or nothing. I'm emptying what was there. So in this little method that we created, this click event method for that button, we're taking what's in that text box, we're assigning that value to our label, and then we're getting rid of what was in that text box. Let's go run our code and see what it looks like. Fred. Submit. It wiped out what was there, and it changed the value associated with that label. Go ahead and stop our code. What else would we need to have in that text box for it to be what it's supposed to be? Let me put a static string literal constant in there. Welcome to the project, space plus. Now this plus, I'm taking a string that's provided by the user. I'm concatenating it to, see what it says there, string operator. I'm concatenating it to or coupling it to. I'm not adding. Adding is a mathematical thing. I am binding these two strings together, connecting them, if you will, so that both those values will then be passed to that text box or to that label. So if I run this, Fred, submit, welcome to the project, Fred. Now I've got some things I want. Function before form. Some things I need to take care of are the form now. And when I say the form, I don't mean this object, the form object. I mean the appearance, the aesthetics of what it is I'm dealing with. Let's make this text bigger so the user can see it. Let's make this bigger. And let's move the submit box because we don't know how big this thing is that they're going to enter. Could be a very long name. All right. So let's go back and look at the aesthetics of it. look at that label. I want the attributes of that label. I'm going to go look at the font, and I'll expand that out. Let me make that 18-point font. Drag it to the side. I'm going 18-point font on that text box as well. I'll drag that out. I'm going to take that button, bring it down here, make it bigger. I'll make that 18-point. You know what? I want to bold it, not just 18-point in size, but I also want to bold it. There we go. And then my output, I want it to be 18-point, bold, bold oblique. All right, so that'll work. I could change the color of my text. There's so much that I can change on it. But we'll leave it at this for now. Okay. I don't need any text in there. That was just so I can see where it is. I'll put it there. I'll get rid of the text. Now I click over here. There's our form as it exists. Let's start it and see how it looks when it runs. Say Fred Miller. Submit. Welcome to the project, Fred Miller. Well, that's great. Everything worked the way I wanted it to work. And it will do that over and over again, but it just runs once. If I wanted to, I can add another button that's a reset button. Let's say that I did something wrong, and I'm going to change this. I'll call it reset btn reset, and this button will have that 18-point bold. I want a click event associated with that button, and that button I want to copy that text, and I don't want it to say welcome to the project. I just want to wipe out what's in that label output. Always end your statements with that semicolon in this language. Always have your opening aligned with your closing curly brace. We can go in, we can put comments to explain what's taking place in each one of these. So now when I run this, there we go. Wait a minute, I didn't size that big enough to where we can actually see it. Let's go ahead and close it and look at it again. There we go. Let's run it. So Fred Miller. Welcome to the project, Fred Miller. Let me reset this thing. Tabitha. So now I can keep going back and forth, and it will continually, as long as I want to keep doing this, take whatever I input and display it. Welcome to the project input. Reset it. Okay, so I created a click event associated with this button. I created a click event associated with this button. I could have just double clicked on it here on the form and that would have done the same thing. But I prefer to come over here and use these actions that are built in when we're talking about click events or mouse events. Okay, so that's our project. We created that solution. All right. And I can come over here. It's by default, it's being saved. I'm going to save everything. And I want to close that solution. So now my solution's gone. Go back and look and see. I called it WinForm Project. Here it is. If I open it, I see the solution folder. I see the solution file. I need that whole project, not just that SLN. So if I come back up, I will right click that, send to, compress zipped folder. Now it's saying I don't have read permissions on it currently, or I've got permission issues. That's because of what I'm doing right now. But all I would need to do is create a compressed zipped folder version of this folder. Okay? All right. That's what gets uploaded to Canvas, is the compressed folder. If I don't have the entire solution folder, that project, I can't open it up to see what's going on. And that's because of all those relationships, all the interoperatings that, remember, I opened this thing up. When I clicked on my SLN, it opened all this up because it was local to the resources associated with it. So if you just sent me the SLN and not that folder that goes along with it, it wouldn't have anything to open up. All right. So that's how this is all working. There's our form1.cs. That's the code, the instance of the class that created this. And then within it, we've got other associations that work along with it, the other objects that are in there. Got our program that has the main in it. And if we went and looked in there, we can see what it's being tied to. New form 1. Now, wait a minute. If I didn't keep that name the same, or if I changed that name, this wouldn't work because it's saying run a new instance of that form 1. This is where I was talking about. Make sure that once you name something, you don't go back and change the name late in the game, because those connections exist. Okay. We've got our project. We've created this thing that will actually run for us. It'll do what we need it to do. And now you know how to upload that. You'll create the compressed file, folder I should say, and upload that entire folder, which gives me everything in here to go look at. So once I've downloaded it, I can open it in Visual Studio, and I have everything I need in here to run it. I'll see you in the next video.